And the question you just been asked, it's been mapped. Here we have the popversoda.com map from Alan McConchy, in which you essentially go into this website, you tell them where you're from, and then you tell them your answer: Coke, pop, soda, whatever. And this is the results. What you can see is definitely a pattern regionally in terms of the American South. Overwhelmingly, they call it Coke. Why? Because Coca-Cola is a southern product. It's from the South. It's from Atlanta, Georgia, where the headquarters of Coke is. It's where they have Coke World, Coca-Cola World, or whatever. So what you have here is you have some other regional patterns. You see, for example, in the northern part of the country, more likely to call it pop, where on the coasts, more likely to call it soda. But also in St. Louis, you kind of see that island of blue right in the middle of the country. In the St. Louis area, much more likely to call it soda. But if we look at Indiana, we can see a pattern in which, if you're from central Indiana, my guess is in the patterns that showcased here with the 3-point activity, you're more likely to call it a Coke. Even though it might be a Pepsi or Dr. Pepper, you still call it a Coke. Whereas if you go away from central Indiana, whether it be to the north or to the south, you see more or hear more people using the term pop. Whereas you go down to the southern border, though, the Ohio River, you can see Coke is more popular. And that the usage of Coke as a term is more popular. That relates to, definitely I would argue, along the Ohio River, you're more southern than you are northern. And so what this showcases, once again, regional differences in dialect in terms of what do you call that liquidy product that has caffeine that tastes so good. Now let's do some dialect examples. So first off, Yinzer's Jeetjet. And so that you, I hope, have no idea what I'm talking about unless you're from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And so what that's essentially asking is, have you guys eaten yet? And so in Pittsburgh, there's definitely a local dialect, which they use words that you wouldn't really use anywhere else in the country. And so it's a good example of a dialect. Another one would be this one here. That chowder is wicked tasty, brah. And so where that might sound at first like that's something from Boston, which it is, actually the word chowder is just more of a pronunciation. So what I did is just, that's how it's pronounced, chowder. Where the key to dialect here, though, is wicked. Now, wicked is not a term that's used heavily outside of this region. So wicked means it's really, really good. Whereas in other places, wicked might not mean the same thing. And so there, the dialect, wicked, is the example of the dialect in this particular sentence. Not so much chowder, because it's just a different pronunciation. Same with bra, as in bro, or whatever. Further accent symbols, another way to showcase this is this long sentence and try to use different examples. First off, if I was from the South, I would start this sentence by combining all those words into just one syllable, jaw. And so it's very much a Southern accent. Do you all? They would just pronounce that jaw. No dat on Tuesday. So some would say dat, and that's more of a Southern thing, particularly New Orleans. They're more likely to say dat with a D instead of with a TH on Tuesday. Very much a Hoosier to say Tuesday, to make an S sound like a Z, several Z's in a row. Further, the police versus police. Police is more of an urban pronunciation, but also you see it in rural areas as well, where police is, where it's not it's police is more pronounced in suburban areas, and it's all pretty much scattered throughout the country. Next up, we have Detroit versus Detroit. So in Indiana, we call it Detroit, but in Michigan, they call it Detroit. So Detroit is definitely another Hoosier pronunciation, a Hoosier accent to that word. Are not going to wash. For some reason in Appalachia, they add an R to wash, to make it sound worse. I don't understand it. But then also dim cells, like dat. Dim cells, another one that's a Southern accent. And then better versus better. And so often in Boston, you hear better instead of better to end, that term or that word. You have that kind of the instead of the Anyway. And so further examples, my grandma has a good grammar. So if I was from Boston, what that would sound like would be, my grandma has good grammar. And so that's an example of accent. So we're really picking on the Boston people, but that's fine because they have the Patriots and the Patriots cheat. In the text, I identified reasons why English is spoken here in North America, but over time, there's definitely a difference between British English and American English. We both use the same alphabet, but there's definitely different pronunciation or accent, different spelling, different vocabulary, different dialects. And so, for example, with spelling, the word color in American English is C-O-L-O-R, whereas in British English, it's C-O-L-O-U-R. So you see a lot of variations in that regard regarding spelling, but of course different in terms of dialect or vocabularies as well. Why? First off, we have to think about isolation, the fact that we're separated by a large water body. So before airplanes, before we could, ships could quickly go across the Atlantic, that isolation allowed us then to kind of come up with our own way to speak, our own spellings, our own different dialects. Further, we came across new things, and so the Americans came across things that weren't, around in the motherland in Great Britain. For example, raccoons, moose, chipmunks, all of those were encountered by early Americans as they went west, and they essentially picked up the Native American names. And so those are, you add in the idea there's no phones for the most part, we up until the 1900s, so there's communication barriers as well. But probably the biggest one is just the fact, we fought a war against the Redcoats. We fought a war against the British, and so it's part of our identity. We don't want to be just like the British. We don't want to speak the same language, speak exactly how they speak it. So that's a lot of it's related to identity as well. So we can tie in cultural identity into this discussion. Now, I'm not going to have you memorize the different language dialects, but we have these general language dialects that started to form after the American Revolution. And so we have what we see, the blue is the northern dialect, the yellow is more of what they call the Midland dialect, and then the red would be the southern dialect. And so dialect and accent can definitely relate with each other. And so these are these early patterns that were observed. And so what would happen is people would pretty much migrate straight to the west. And so that's why we have this linear pattern. So we were settled along the East Coast, and as we worked our way across towards the Mississippi, towards the Great Plains, we then bring with us our language, our dialect, our accent, what have you. But one of the things is you notice out west, you have a whole lot of green. And one thing you'll notice, there really isn't that much of a distinctive accent, or much of a dialect as well, but not much of a distinctive accent as you would find along the East Coast. And so the East Coast, you got the Boston, you got the beta, and then things, with that ass sound, versus the Southern drawl, where you talk real slow, but you make words stretch real long. And so what you have is you have different accents. So why in the West Coast is there really no distinctive accent? Might have a different dialect, gnarly bro, but as far as accent, there really isn't that much difference. And key to this is the fact that if we think about this particular part of the country, is where everyone migrated to. And so what happened was along the East Coast, specific groups settled in those specific areas from the United Kingdom, from Great Britain. And then they worked their way across the West, and so they brought with them their dialects. However, once everyone got to the West, everything just got mixed together. Everything just blended together. And so when we think about the West Coast, why is there really no distinctive accent? Is the fact that the Southern and New Englanders and the Mid-Atlantic people would all then mush together. When you have also thrown into immigrants from outside the country, the West is just a nice fusion of all of that. Now I'm going to just go through some funny examples of things being lost in translation. So kind of when English, or when ideas go global, sometimes the slogan might not be translated the way it should be. And here's the guy named Frank Perdue. Perdue Chicken, a famous chicken brand. They're more popular in the East Coast, especially New York. It's not who Purdue's named after, spelled different. But he came up with this famous line, his famous motto for his chicken: "It takes a strong man to make a tender chicken." When that was translated into Spanish, when he started to go global, you can see how that was definitely lost in translation. So I'm not an expert on the Spanish language, but you can probably predict the words that weren't translated properly in that example. Here's another one, ballpoint pen manufacturing company. I know no one really uses ballpoint pens anymore, but in the 80s everyone did. So they had this slogan: "It won't leak in your pocket and embarrass you." And once again, let's go to Mexico and put this logo all over a bus. And obviously that didn't work out either. So I believe embarazada, I'm not, once again, a Spanish expert at all, but I believe that might translate into as pregnant. So that's what happened there. Further, KFC finger licking good. So once again, we talked about KFC. It's got all those stores in China. 10,000 of them to be exact. Well, here's the translation there in China. Obviously, not funny if your fingers are no longer there. Here's a map that shows the percentage of the population who speak a language other than English at home. So in other words, the states in which there's more than English being spoken in large amounts. And that's, of course, going to be our border states to our southern border. And so that makes a lot of sense. The American Southwest, heavily Latina / Latino, large Hispanic population, so that makes sense for sure. Other places you're going to see is large metropolitan areas, places that have big cities. Big cities attract international migrants, and so Chicago, LA, New York City, much of the New England, Mid-Atlantic area. So that helps to explain why we see these different patterns. But for the most part, the American South and the Midwest, Great Plains, we see very little variation in terms of the languages being spoken, because English is the dominant language. Of course, there along the southern border with Mexico, we're going to have this blending occur. And this blending is something we call syncretism. So you take two things that are unique or different, combine them, you create something new. So you essentially take the Spanish language, combine with it the English language, you get something new called Spanglish. So some examples of Spanglish we find in this top quote, "Presta mi su credit card." That essentially is translated, "Lend me your credit card." Credit card, not a Spanish term or phrase, definitely an English phrase. And the next one, it says buy and sell cars. So C-A-R-R-O-S is not in the Spanish language. It essentially is cars. It borrows cars from the English language. Finally, the last one essentially is asking, where do you work? With the idea that you punch in a punch clock, punch your card at the time clock, something that you used to do when you have to come into work. You punch in, you punch out. So that's essentially asking, where do you punch, or where do you punch in, or essentially, where do you work? So all this is examples of Spanglish in which you fuse together two different languages to create something new so you can communicate. Up in Canada, there's one particular province, which is just like how we have states in the United States, one particular province in which it's completely French-speaking, and that's Quebec. So Quebec is a part of Canada in which people speak their own or separate language from the rest of the country. So this kind of lends, of course, to this natural fusion of what they call Franglais, where you combine French with English, Franglais. So essentially what this is this fusion, the syncretism. But the French, they're a little bit, they're not too cool with this. The French definitely want to protect their particular language. They absolutely hate it when people use Franglais. So they're ones that really are all about protecting their language, even if they're the ones in French Canada. They all are really hardcore about protecting their French identity. Here's some specific examples of Franglais, which is essentially the incorporation of English into the French language, and that's definitely how the French would view it too. So this is some examples. First off, je suis tired. Tired is not a French term; it's an English term. Next up is longtemps pas voir. What that means is essentially long time no see. Finally, je ne care pas. So care is not part of the French language. It's inserted into there to say I don't care, and yeah, I don't care either. One of my buddies went over to South Africa, took this picture in which they allowed me to use of some examples of how South Africans have kind of, you see this fusion, this syncretism, where they blend in some English with the native languages. Now let's look at Indiana more specifically, and other than English, the most common language spoken is what's being mapped here, and that yellow or light yellow color is Spanish. And so Spanish, overwhelmingly, you can see it, and it's largely due to the more recent in-migration of Latino immigrants to the United States, but also to Indiana. Some other exceptions you do see there, you see some small places where you see German. Those are the light green areas, and so Germans have heavily settled throughout the 1800s in this particular area of the country, and we can still see that legacy today. Some examples of that from Jasper, Indiana, Du Bois County. It's a county which is heavily German. They have one of the largest German-American festivals each year called the Strassenfest. So you can see German influences still to this day in Indiana, particularly in those rural counties. If you look at that light blue county, that's Chinese. That's the role of Indiana University and its large number of temporary immigrants or people working for the university that are from Asia, in particular, obviously China. So we can see that Spanish dominates, but there's some small little clusters where you see different languages being spoken. What we have here is the most prevalent language other than English and Spanish. And so, once again, Indiana is a nice mix of a lot of different things, but overwhelmingly you can see a lot of the German influences for sure. But then in the northern part of the state, you see a little bit more Polish, the purple up there. You see a little bit of French kind of there in the northern central and the west central areas, kind of where the Wabash River might be. So essentially we were kind of a mix here in Indiana of all kinds of different languages, different groups, but for the most part, we are overwhelmingly English speaking, overwhelmingly. And finally, a pie chart that kind of explains more of what I've been saying. But other than English, like I said, 92.23% of the population over 5 years speaks English. But the exceptions, those that speak another language, we can see the percentages here in overwhelmingly Spanish, in the Germans, and then the Chinese and the Pennsylvania Dutch, which are basically Germans, and so forth.